The Tesla's gull-wing doors hissed shut behind me as if the car itself wanted to close the past away. I stood for a long moment on the curb, the engine's low hum still vibrating under my feet. $129,000. Paid in full. No loans. No reminders. 4 years of austerity, nights spent scribbling numbers until my eyes blurred, lunches reheated at my desk, clients who paid late and then referred me to more clients. All of it had a price and I had paid it. The sheet of paper with the total still seemed miraculous in my wallet, like a receipt for a life I had bought back. Nathaniel Reed was waiting at the top of the condominium steps. Tall, sunburned, linen shirt slightly unbuttoned, a face that had once been carved into my ribcage. He had been effortless then, and he was effortless now. Men like him were designed to be noticed without trying. They left a small trail of people rearranged around them like dominoes. When his eyes found me, the brief flicker of surprise was almost delicious. "Claire," he said, and his smile folded nostalgia inside itself, small and tentative. "Hi," I said, and the single syllable landed like a coin on glass. I let the silk of my blouse catch in the light, let my heels click as I walked. The Chanel bag at my arm was not ostentatious. This was not screaming wealth. This was a whisper that wealth had arrived. He stepped forward. Up close, he smelled of espresso and expensive sunscreen. He looked at me like a man finally solving a puzzle he had given up on. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I answered. "But here we are." We talked like two people measuring the distance between the present and a past neither of us wanted to resurrect fully. He mentioned Reed Capital's expansion into biotech, the new board members, a condo in Malibu, whose pictures had graced Instagram. I nodded, asked questions, let the memory of being abandoned ache in the undercurrent of my throat. It was a private ache now, a small ember that I kept for warmth. That night, I lay awake on the mattress of my new apartment, modest by Reed's standards but a victory by mine, and replayed the first meeting like a film. I had not come back for closure. Closure was childish and brief. I had come back for consequence. 8 years prior, when Nathaniel left, he left as a rumor I could not disprove. He had been my partner and everything that mattered to me then. My first startup, my creative naivete, my belief that two people who loved each other could bootstrap a future. He had a way of making plans sound like fate and then stepping off to let those plans land in his lap and not mine. He'd taken a role at a hedge fund, then a seat on a board, then a life where his social calendar had little room for people who demanded more than he was willing to give. He left with a smirk and a text that read, "I need space," which felt like a verdict. I had been 28, raw from heartbreak and poor decisions. The investor meeting we'd lost, the unpaid legal bills, the phone calls that dried up. He slipped out of our shared life like a thief who'd learned to wear your keys. By the time I realized I'd been banking on him more than I'd admitted, I had nothing left. Not savings. Not a reference that didn't carry the faint smell of abandonment. Not even the dog I'd adopted in a vulnerable moment. I learned to hide my trembling hands behind spreadsheets and take temp jobs that taught humility like a bitter herb. I learned other things, too. I learned to be precise. I learned to take numbers apart the way a watchmaker unclasped gears, to see which parts were essential and which had been welded together by pride. I taught myself to read contracts as if they were love letters disguised as legalese, to see where the signature might be hidden and what had been promised in the fine print. Slowly, methodically, I rebuilt. Success was not a single thunderbolt. It was the accumulation of small, unromantic victories. I freelanced as a UX consultant for a boutique agency and invested the earnings in index funds. I picked mentors who asked clearing and difficult questions and then ignored them twice as often as I should have. I slept less and read more. When an old client needed temporary CFO help, I said yes and then stayed months, piecing together cash flows, winning trust with competence. The reputation that had been mine, however ragged, began to dress itself again in new clothes. I remarried myself to a discipline that killed whimsy and birthed profit. A quiet portfolio became 2, then 3. I learned the small art of being invisible when learning was required, and loud when the world needed to see me. 5 years later, I had a modest fund under management, an LLC registered in Delaware, and a network that included an investigative journalist named Mara Sue and a forensic accountant named Ben Ortiz. Both of them would be the scalpel and rope in the hands of someone who knew how to use them without leaving fingerprints. I did not tell them how I knew Nathaniel. I told Mara and Ben the truth in a different language. I presented an anonymous tip that suggested a small pattern, an oddity in Reed Capital's filings, certificates that pointed toward a shell corporation, payments labeled as consulting that fed a junior partner's South American accounts. Mara's eyes lit up the way mine did when I found an overlooked comma in a contract. Ben smiled like a man who had loved puzzles since childhood. Both said yes in the exact measured way I needed, because what I asked for required patience and discretion. The seduction was theater, and in theater, timing is everything. I kept the parts of me Nathaniel remembered, the laugh, the inclination to forgive quickly, the small habit of tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, and I used them like instruments. But I wore them with new hands. Where before I had begged to matter, now I cultivated allure as armor. We frequented the same places, charity dinners that doubled as hunting grounds for board members, gallery openings where art buyers whispered about climate tech, an intimate sushi bar tucked behind a florist where the maitre d' knew Nathaniel's favorite sake. I let him win small things, the final glass of wine, the choice of which film to see. I let him think himself the cause of my smile. He called the first week. He was sure I had a new life. "You vanish for a decade and then reappear in linen," he said over the phone, the amused cadence I remembered so clearly. "You always had dramatic timing." "I do," I said. "It's a gift." He invited me to a housewarming, his new penthouse, a space where marble met aeroponic herb garden, and the skyline looked like a paper cutout. I said yes, and I brought Dom Perignon 2010. $250 a bottle, a number he would not notice except as a detail of taste, which suited me. I wore a dress that cost less than his condo's monthly HOA. The effect, not the price, mattered. We made the sort of love people would call inevitable at the end of a romantic film. There were no fireworks, only a slow, certain convergence that felt like both forgiveness and conquest. He told me about projects, a cold storage facility for vaccine research, a charity that would put his name on a plaza. He told me about the pressure from investors. The current quarter's numbers needed to be pretty, not revolutionary. He confided in me with the dangerous intimacy of a man who believed I had nothing left to gain from him. I let him believe I was brittle and easily comforted. I let him corner me in the kitchen and press his forehead to mine, confessing mistakes with a shaky, guilty laugh. I let him bring me into a world where his vanity could heat the room like a radiator. All the while, Ben found irregularities in the public disclosures, and Mara traced offshore transfers that led to anonymous growth firms with 0 employees and a lot of summer addresses. I did not do the dirty work. I recruited the people who could translate suspicion into facts. Ben, gentle and methodical, traced invoices and matched them to trademark filings in jurisdictions that specialized in opacity. Mara, fierce and exacting, compared lobbyist calendars and emails, finding correlations between campaign donations and lucrative contracts Reed Capital's portfolio companies had received. Together, with the slow rhythm of people who love the taste of a good reveal, they built a story. But the takedown had to be artful. Public shaming without evidence would have been only noise. What I wanted required a collapse so thorough it could not be reassembled. I wanted regulators and shareholders to see, then to act, not mobs on social media whose fury could be redirected or dampened by a very persuasive PR defense. I wanted the board to question him, investors to pull their money, auditors to dig, and the press to follow like they always do when numbers and ego collide. So I seeded doubt where doubt could grow natural roots. One evening, as the city glittered like a field of broken promises, we attended a fundraiser at a modernist museum. Nathaniel, charming and attentive, introduced me to his CFO, a man named Derek Fallon who admired the right cufflinks and hated spreadsheets he could not control. I smiled, shook hands, and after 3 drinks I asked the question I positioned myself to ask months ago. "Derek," I said casually, like the thought had formed in the moment, "I read a concerning note about Reed Biotech supply chain. There was a mention of a consulting firm, Stonebridge Global, in the filings. I don't remember seeing it in your press releases." Derek's smile tightened. "Stonebridge handles procurement in parts of Latin America. It's standard. It's in Panama, right?" I asked, and he blinked. A board member overheard and asked for clarification. When Derek began fumbling, the seed sprouted. Later that night, I excused myself and texted Mara one word: Stonebridge. By the time Derek's panic registered, the boardroom had produced a new query. Once a corporate inquiry lives on the books, auditors do not sleep well. Reed's CFO asked for a review. The auditors said yes. The rational machinery of corporate governance, a thing that makes giants tremble, began to whir. I never touched a ledger, but I touched the right people, so the ledgers would touch themselves. When the first piece hit, a quiet article in Mara's column that read like a careful map of a wound, the reactions were delicate and slow. Anonymous sources suggest links between payments labeled consulting and advisory firms registered in tax havens, the lead read. It was tidy, objective, unimpassioned. Reed Capital's stock slid a sliver. Nathaniel called me at 2 a.m, voice raw. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I didn't do anything," I said, and for once, the truth was both a weapon and a shield. "I just asked a question in a lobby." He sobered. "Someone's out to get me." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe someone's asking hard questions." The board called a special session. Reed, cornered by partner unease and the slow drip of headlines, agreed to permit an internal probe. Derek, sweating, promised full cooperation. At dinner afterward, we danced like people who had survived a storm. He put his hand at the small of my back and murmured promises both grand and ridiculous. He bought me a Saint Laurent dress on loan from a boutique, an indulgence that glittered like forgiveness bought at retail. I let him. I allowed myself to be seen in the scene he wanted to imagine, because the scene helped him unmask. And while he unmasked, Ben found more. Payments disguised as travel allowances that vanished into a holding company with no employees, invoices that paid for private dinners in Buenos Aires that were billed as R&D workshops. I sat quietly through it all, the picture collector who never shows her whole collection until the canvas is complete. There were nights, not often but enough to make me doubt, where I woke and felt the old fracture inside my chest. I remember the nights when I'd walked home under streetlights and imagined him enjoying success on rooftops I could not afford. There were times when his tender words scratched at me, made me almost tell him everything. But tenderness, like champagne, can be breathed out to keep someone happy without letting them drink too deeply. I wanted him to feel his victory, to believe he had rekindled something. That belief would make the loss deeper. They found a transfer from Reed Capital to a foundation in the Caymans that had no charitable activity and was registered in a nominee's name. The auditors flagged it and asked for documentation. The documents did not exist. In private, Derek called me. "Claire," he pleaded, "you don't have to do this." I leaned against the kitchen counter in his penthouse, marble cool under my palm. The door to the balcony stood open. The skyline had a clean blue edge. I let myself look at him with the affection someone reserves for a close brush with the past. "You could tell them," I said. "You could fix it." His laugh trembled. "It's not that simple." "No," I agreed. "It never is. But sometimes it's simple enough for everyone to see." He left half assured, half shaking. He reported the finding, which forced Nathaniel's hand. The company brought an outside counsel, and in the cold luminescence of conference rooms, a different Nathaniel emerged, one who used his voice not with charm but with insistence. "This is a misunderstanding," he'd say. "There are explanations scattered like confetti under a storm. Regulators have a methodical hunger. When they find a pattern, they do not rest." Investors, who had always preferred a CEO who could charm them, suddenly took to meetings with an edge, asking questions that sounded like daggers. The stock price, which had basked in the glow of his charisma, began to wobble. Reed's enemies, which are many because of the world they swim in, smelled blood. I did not celebrate publicly. I simply liked a photo of him where he looked tired on a rooftop, and the like felt like a pimpered joy. In the folds of my new life, small satisfactions have a way of tasting divine. The collapse was not a single blast. It was an attrition. A client withdrew a contract. A senator requested records. A major investor quietly filed for a seat on the board. A journalist, not Mara but another outlet that would not print sensationally but would print thoroughly, published an account of a fundraising dinner billed as a retreat, where a young executive appeared to be performing work for a shell company that had, in turn, moved money through a chain of trusts. The board voted to place Nathaniel on administrative leave while they cooperated with investigators. His phone became a siren of missed calls. Social media was not kind. Threads began to compile the fragments of rumor into narratives that read like parables. Influence in certain circles dried like a puddle under a hot lamp. He came to me in one of the last days before the public let the air out of his bubble. He stood in my doorway, the man who had once believed himself immune to consequence. His suit looked like a costume now, tailored, yes, but somehow hollow. "Claire," he said, and there was a plea in it that nudged the old tenderness awake for a moment. "Please, help me. Say something. Tell them it's a mistake. I could have lied. I could have saved him in the way that people with shared history sometimes do, by swallowing the truth and letting the narrative mend itself. That was the easier path, one I had once chosen and bitterly regretted. Instead, I reached into my bag and slid a slim envelope across the table. "What's this?" "Documentation," I said. "A record of irregularities. It's what the auditors asked for." He paled. "Claire." My voice was a scalpel. "You once told me that love was about trust. You taught me that if you love someone, you would never set them up for something that might ruin them. I believed you. Then you left." He closed his eyes like a man who had been punched. He took the envelope on fingers that trembled. He read and read until the room blurred. "You could just sign a statement," he said finally. "Say it was a mistake. If only it were that small. If only betrayal resembled a broken teacup that could be glued and left to dry." "No," I said. "You could have asked me for help when things got hard. You could have been honest." He sank to the couch like he'd been unmoored. "I thought if I left, you'd be better off." "You thought wrong," I replied, "and others will see it now. Not because I wanted them to. Because it's true." He stared at the ceiling like a man who had no metaphors left. For a long time he did not speak. When he finally looked at me, there was shame and a child's pleading that made me ache. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything." I had practiced what forgiveness sounded like in these final scenes. It would be something that did not absolve, because absolution could be taken as permission. "I forgive you," I said, "but forgiveness isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. It doesn't erase consequences." He left that night with a small bag of essentials, his confidence diminished to the size someone carries in a pocket. The market moved in little precipitates. A civil suit was threatened. Reed Capital hired a PR firm that tried to spin the narrative. Internal cultural disagreements, growing pains, uneven reporting. But facts like stones are difficult to throw far when the tide wants to scatter them. The thing about revenge in real life is that it rarely ends with a grand fireworks display. There is paperwork and lawyers and a slow bureaucratic hunger that takes what you feed it, quiet and remorseless. The thrill, if there is any, is in the clarity. I had wanted not to be cruel, but to be just. A hard justice shaped by consequence rather than cruelty. But I am not a monk. I take some personal satisfaction in the small and precise. Weeks after the initial disclosures, Reed Capital's lead investor, a man whose fortune is measured in islands and philanthropy, withdrew support. The stock halved over a month. Reports of a pending SEC inquiry circulated. Nathaniel found bank lines tightened, partnerships evaporating like morning haze. He did not lose everything at once. Life resists the dramatic script often read by screenwriters. He lost much, a house sold, some art that fetched less than expected, favors he had assumed never stopped being owed. He lost friends who preferred distance to discomfort. He lost the smell of unearned invulnerability. I watched it unfold in private, like a person who observes a wild animal succumbing to age. Clinical, a little sad, but in me something settled. Once, when the worst of the press storm had passed, he called. The voice-mail landed like a stone. "Claire," he whispered into the phone, "I have nothing left to say, but if you ever want to meet, to talk to, I don't know. I owe you nothing." I did not call back. Instead, I deleted the message and opened an email that announced a small grant I had arranged to help young entrepreneurs in underserved neighborhoods, a program I named for the years I had spent surviving. The best revenge, I told myself, was to build something that lasted. There were moments when the plan's success felt peculiarly hollow. I had counted the cost and paid for it, but victory is never free from loneliness. At a private dinner hosted by a venture partner, someone asked me, with gentle curiosity, if I ever regretted the coldness that had carried me through. I paused, considering the question as if it were a delicacy to be tasted slowly. "The truth is," I answered, "I regret that I was ever naive enough to let someone be my world. The rest is consequence." Romantic revenge, myths often promise a love returned or a soul set free. For me, freedom was not a dramatic closing scene. It was subtle. A morning where I could have coffee and not check my bank account 24 times. A night where I slept without the old fear of waking to a message that would split me open. A day when the headlights on my Tesla meant something I had earned rather than a loan I had to service. Months later, at a small cafe in Venice, I met a man named Micah, a photographer with a laugh that sounded like a promised secret. He owned a 2006 Subaru Outback with a faded bumper sticker that read, "Take the scenic route." He did not ask me about my past. He asked me about the last book I'd read, about the way sunlight falls on a canyon at golden hour. His life, unlike Nathaniel's, had an economy of small things and a generosity of attention. He could not give me a yacht or a board seat. He could, however, promise to notice the layers of me without trying to reduce them. We fell into a friendship that, over time, eased into something warmer. Micah's touch was not a strategy. His presence was not a device. It was messy, ordinary, and something I had overlooked when I equated romance with theatrics. There is a kind of victory in being able to choose softness without fear. I dated carefully, enjoying candlelight that did not double as a spotlight. I traveled with friends whose laughter was not performative but sincere. I directed a small microgrant program to help women founders and sat in on meetings with Mara, who had become a friend and occasional collaborator. Ben moved out of forensic accounting and into teaching. His smile broadened the way it does for people who have discovered contentment. Every so often, my phone would buzz with a news alert about Reed Capital, another lawsuit here, a settlement there, and for a moment something in me tightened. Then I would remember Manhattan rooftops, the taste of Dom Perignon that night in his kitchen, his face when he realized how much of his life had been propped up by legerdemain. The tightness released like old tape. There is one final knife twist I keep to myself as both an indulgence and a mercy. Months after the downfall, when Nathaniel had taken a small, quiet job at a boutique consulting firm and lived in a smaller apartment with fewer friends, he reached me again. This time the voice was steady and small. "Can we talk?" he asked. I agreed to a meeting in public, a small diner on the Lower East Side where people come to remember their 20s and order pancakes. He arrived looking both older and strangely younger, as if the stripping away had exposed an earlier version of himself. We ate and we talked. There were apologies, and there was, for both of us, a careful mapping of how we had hurt each other. He told me about fear. He told me about the nights he had spent rereading our old emails about the blank space where a bridge should have been. He asked for forgiveness the way men sometimes ask for absolution with the portability of a penitent. I forgave him, carefully and fully, but forgiveness did not mean reconciliation. Reconciliation is an architecture that requires both parties to build together. He had burned the scaffolding. Forgiveness meant releasing the hunger to be understood by him. It meant refusing to make him the center of my narrative again. We parted with a hug that felt like closure, and as he walked away I felt a grain of gratitude for the woman I'd become. She had been patient, she had been elegant, and she had exacted her dues without jettisoning the person she wanted to be. I had not become him. I had become myself, and that was the victory. The ocean's horizon has a way of reminding me that life is wide and that vengeance, when done with integrity, need not consume you. There are mornings when I push open the curtains and sunlight runs like liquid gold across the floor of my living room. I water my plants, answer emails, take calls from Mara about a new investigation she's begun. She always includes me in the margins now because we share a tendency for precision. I tutor a woman entrepreneur once a week, helping her understand term sheets and capitalization tables in plain language that makes power accessible instead of frightening. Sometimes, late at night, I drive my Tesla down the coast, tunes low, and think of all the nights I spent rebuilding my life. I think of the cost and of a small arithmetic of patience, counting months into years, saving a few dollars here and there, investing in people who understood the beauty of truth. There is a satisfaction in watching the arc of a life bend toward dignity. If someone asked me if I regretted the revenge, I would say no. I would tell them a story not of triumph over a single person, but of triumph over the endless pattern that had once defined me. I would say that the sweetest victory is not in the ruin, but in the rebuild. A woman in the corner of a cafe once asked me what I'd do differently if I could do it all again. I smiled at her and thought of the young version of myself who had thought love should be unquestioning and blind. I'd teach her to value herself first, I said. I'd teach her that love is not permission to be taken from. She nodded like I'd given her a map. I have no more desire to be revenge's poster child. I prefer the quietness that comes with having choices. I prefer the slow pleasures, a well-brewed coffee, a text from a friend that says, "Let's hike Saturday," the smell of rain on hot asphalt. Nathaniel is a chapter. The scandal faded into the background noise of finance columns and evening TV pundits, someone else's cautionary tale for a moment. My story continued, written in ink that could not be smudged by his small attempts at redemption. In the end, the best revenge was not the ruin. The best revenge was resuming a life that refused to be defined by his absence. It was a new rhythm of days, of work and play and quiet victories. It was learning to laugh again without measuring how much my chest would break. It was buying a second Tesla, a small joke I told myself, and trading it in for a practical Subaru when I met Micah. He liked roof racks and long drives, and I liked that there was a man who loved me for the way I buckled the bike on top and laughed at the weather. I had returned rich and beautiful, yes, but the truth I kept close is smaller and kinder. I returned whole. And once in a while, I look at the skyline, the line between the high buildings and the open air, and I think about small arithmetic again. That's saving, investing, learning, and choosing with care all add up. They add up to a life that is yours and yours alone. He thought he had won me back. He miscalculated. I had always been winning. I just hadn't understood the rules until I rewrote them for myself. Claire Vale,